It was just a portrait of a mother and her baby, but look more closely at his face. In the autumn of 1917, as the Great War raged across Europe and America stood on the precipice of change, a photograph appeared in the window of a small portrait studio on Bleecker Street in New York City. The image seemed unremarkable at first glance. A young woman in a simple cotton dress cradling an infant, both staring directly at the camera, with expressions that might have been interpreted as serene. But those who paused long enough to study the photograph noticed something unsettling about the child's face, something that didn't belong in a portrait, meant to capture maternal tenderness and innocence. The studio belonged to Samuel Rothstein, a Polish immigrant who had built a modest reputation photographing families in Greenwich Village and the Lower East Side. His storefront, wedged between a butcher shop and a tailor, served working-class families who saved for months to afford a single portrait. Samuel prided himself on capturing authentic moments, refusing to employ the heavy retouching techniques popular in uptown studios. He believed photographs should preserve truth, not manufacture it. This philosophy made him beloved among neighborhood residents, but kept him perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. On October 12th, a Friday morning thick with fog rolling off the Hudson River, a woman entered Samuel's studio carrying a bundle wrapped in a worn shawl. She gave her name as Mrs. Catherine Wells and explained she wanted a portrait with her son before her husband shipped out to France with the American Expeditionary Forces. Her voice carried the flat vowels of rural Pennsylvania, and her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the infant. Samuel noticed immediately that she avoided eye contact, her gaze fixed somewhere past his left shoulder as she spoke. The baby, perhaps 8 months old, remained eerily still throughout the entire interaction. Samuel had photographed hundreds of infants, and he understood their unpredictable nature. They squirmed, cried, reached for the camera, or fell asleep at inopportune moments. But this child did none of those things. As Catherine positioned herself in the chair before the backdrop, the baby simply stared ahead with an intensity that made Samuel uncomfortable. The infant's eyes, pale grey in the dim studio light, seemed to track Samuel's movements with an awareness that felt distinctly adult. When Samuel finally triggered the shutter, capturing the image that would later hang in his window, he felt a chill run down his spine despite the studio's stuffy warmth. Catherine paid him $3, promised to return in a week to collect the finished portrait, and left without another word. Samuel developed the photograph that evening in his darkroom, a converted closet that reeked of chemicals and old water damage. As the image emerged in the developing tray, he found himself transfixed by the baby's face. The child's expression held something he couldn't quite articulate, a quality that transcended the usual vacant innocence of infant portraits. The eyes seemed to contain knowledge, perhaps even calculation. Samuel told himself he was being foolish, that the long hours and poor ventilation were affecting his judgment. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph had captured something fundamentally wrong. He placed the portrait in his display window on Wednesday morning, October 17th, alongside images of smiling families, stern patriarchs, and young couples. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the studio. Samuel initially assumed they were reading the war bond poster he'd hung beside the photographs, but when he stepped outside to investigate, he realized they were all staring at Catherine Wells and her baby. A heavy-set man in a dockworker's cap stood closest to the glass, his face pressed nearly against the window. When Samuel asked if he could help him, the man turned with an expression of profound discomfort and said simply, "That baby ain't right, something about his face." Others in the crowd murmured agreement before dispersing, leaving Samuel alone with his growing unease. Over the following days, more people stopped to study the photograph. Some spent only seconds before hurrying away, while others stood transfixed for minutes at a time. Samuel noticed a pattern. Nearly everyone who looked at the portrait for more than a few moments developed the same disturbed expression, a mixture of confusion and instinctive revulsion. A young mother with her own infant turned away abruptly, clutching her child closer. An elderly woman crossed herself and muttered something in Italian that Samuel didn't understand. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Catherine Wells had first entered his studio, Samuel had decided to remove the photograph from the window. Something about it was affecting people in ways he couldn't explain, and it was bad for business. But Catherine Wells never returned to claim her portrait. Samuel waited through October and into November, as the war news grew grimmer and the weather turned bitter. He made inquiries in the neighborhood, describing the Pennsylvania woman with trembling hands, but no one recognized her description. The address she'd provided on her receipt led to a boarding house on Christie Street, where the landlady insisted no one by that name had ever rented a room. Samuel began to wonder if he'd imagined the entire encounter, but the photograph remained as tangible proof of their interaction. He kept it in a drawer beneath his counter, taking it out occasionally to study that strange infant face, searching for an explanation that continued to elude him. Detective Frank Corrigan first heard about the photograph on November 8th, when his sister mentioned it during their weekly dinner at her apartment on Mulberry Street. Margaret Corrigan had lived in Little Italy for 15 years, raising 4 children, while her husband worked at the Navy Yard in Brooklyn. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of neighborhood gossip and an instinct for sensing trouble that Frank had learned to respect during his 12 years with the New York Police Department. That evening, as she served him overcooked pot roast and boiled potatoes, she mentioned the strange photograph at Rothstein's studio, almost casually. But Frank detected an undercurrent of genuine concern in her voice. Margaret explained that several women in the neighborhood had become convinced the photograph was cursed or carried some form of evil influence. They'd begun avoiding Bleecker Street entirely, forcing their children to take longer routes to school rather than past the studio. One woman claimed her daughter had nightmares for 3 consecutive nights after glimpsing the portrait through the window. Another insisted the baby's eyes seemed to follow her as she walked past. Frank initially dismissed these concerns as superstitious nonsense, the kind of immigrant folklore that still persisted in neighborhoods where old-world beliefs remained stronger than rational thought. But Margaret pressed him to investigate, arguing that even if the supernatural explanations were ridiculous, something about the photograph was clearly disturbing people in a measurable way. The following afternoon, Frank walked to Rothstein's studio during his lunch break. The November wind cut through his wool coat as he navigated sidewalks crowded with pushcart vendors and afternoon shoppers. Greenwich Village maintained a distinct character in 1917, a mix of working-class immigrant families, bohemian artists, and political radicals who gathered in cafes to debate socialism and anarchism. Frank had walked these streets countless times during his years as a beat cop before making detective, and he understood their rhythms and tensions. The war had changed things, introducing new anxieties and suspicions. German Americans faced harassment despite having lived in the neighborhood for generations. Young men received draft notices and disappeared to training camps. Women stood in increasingly long lines at grocers, complaining about shortages and rising prices. Samuel Rothstein looked up warily when Frank entered the studio, his expression suggesting he'd been expecting this visit for some time. Frank introduced himself and explained he'd heard concerns about a particular photograph. Relief flooded Samuel's face as he retrieved the portrait from beneath his counter, handling it carefully as though it might shatter. He laid it on the counter between them, and Frank studied the image with the practiced eye of someone trained to notice details others might miss. He saw a young woman, plain-featured and exhausted-looking, holding an infant against her chest. The woman's expression revealed nothing remarkable, just the resigned weariness common among working-class mothers in 1917. But the baby's face made Frank pause. He couldn't immediately identify what disturbed him about the child. The infant appeared healthy, well-proportioned, with no obvious deformities or abnormalities. Yet something in the eyes, in the subtle arrangement of features, triggered an instinctive discomfort that Frank found difficult to rationalize. The baby seemed to be staring not at the camera, but through it, with an intensity that felt predatory rather than innocent. Frank had seen hundreds of crime scene photographs during his career, images of violence and death that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But this portrait of a mother and child unsettled him in a different way, one that felt more personal and inexplicable. Samuel recounted the entire story, from Catherine Wells's initial visit to her subsequent disappearance. He provided the false address, described her appearance and manner, and admitted his own growing obsession with understanding what the photograph had captured. Frank listened carefully, taking notes in the small leather notebook he carried in his coat pocket. When Samuel finished, Frank asked if he could borrow the photograph for a few days. Samuel agreed immediately, seeming relieved to have it removed from his studio. Frank slipped the portrait into a manila envelope and promised to return it within the week. Back at the precinct house on Charles Street, Frank showed the photograph to several colleagues, curious whether they would react as others had. The responses varied, but followed a consistent pattern. Most officers glanced at it briefly, made some dismissive comment, and returned to their paperwork. But a few, like Frank himself, studied it longer and grew visibly uncomfortable. Officer Donnelly, an Irish immigrant who'd worked in the precinct for 20 years, actually pushed the photograph away after several seconds and told Frank to keep that thing off his desk. When Frank asked what bothered him about it, Donnelly struggled to articulate his reaction, finally settling on, "It's like that baby knows something terrible, something no infant should know." That evening, Frank took the photograph home to his cramped apartment on Jane Street. He lived alone, having never married, in 2 rooms filled with books and police case files he brought home against department regulations. He pinned the portrait to the wall beside his desk and sat staring at it for nearly an hour, trying to understand its effect on people. The rational part of his mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the lighting in Rothstein's studio had created unusual shadows that gave the infant's face an unsettling quality. Maybe the chemical developing process had introduced some artifact that altered the image in subtle ways. Or possibly, people were simply projecting their own anxieties onto an otherwise ordinary photograph, influenced by the stress and fear that permeated the city in late 1917. But Frank's instincts, honed by years of police work, suggested something more complex was at play. He'd learned to trust his gut reactions to people and situations, and his gut told him this photograph represented a genuine mystery worth investigating. The question was whether it constituted a police matter or simply an inexplicable oddity. Catherine Wells had committed no crime by commissioning a portrait and then failing to collect it. The photograph itself depicted no illegal activity. Yet Frank couldn't shake the conviction that something was profoundly wrong, that the image in front of him connected to something larger and more troubling than a woman's unexplained absence. Frank began his investigation the following morning by visiting the boarding house on Christie Street, where Catherine Wells had allegedly resided. The building stood in a section of the Lower East Side where tenements pressed against each other like crooked teeth, their fire escapes zigzagging down brick facades blackened by decades of coal smoke. The landlady, a suspicious woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who spoke English with a thick Polish accent, insisted no one matching Catherine's description had ever rented a room in her establishment. She kept meticulous records, she explained, showing Frank a ledger filled with names, dates, and payment amounts recorded in careful script. Frank examined the pages for October, but found no Catherine Wells listed. He spent the rest of that day canvassing the neighborhood, showing the photograph to shopkeepers, street vendors, and residents who gathered on stoops despite the November cold. Most people shook their heads, claiming they'd never seen the woman or child. A few reacted strongly to the infant's face, expressing the same instinctive discomfort Frank had observed elsewhere. An elderly Jewish man who ran a pushcart selling used books studied the photograph for a long moment before saying something in Yiddish and making a warding gesture with his hand. When Frank asked what he'd said, the man replied in broken English, "Some faces carry bad spirits. This child has old eyes, very old." By evening, Frank had made no progress in identifying Catherine Wells or understanding why she'd provided false information. He returned to the precinct house frustrated and increasingly convinced that he was wasting time on what amounted to an unsolvable oddity. His captain, a gruff Irishman named O'Brien who had little patience for mysteries that didn't involve obvious crimes, had already questioned why Frank was devoting resources to tracking down a woman who'd simply failed to collect a photograph. "We've got actual criminals to catch," O'Brien had reminded him. "Real murders, robberies, assaults, not ghost stories about creepy baby pictures." But Frank couldn't let it go. That evening, he visited the main branch of the New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, arriving an hour before closing. The marble halls echoed with his footsteps, as he made his way to the reference desk, where a severe-looking librarian in wire-rimmed spectacles asked how she could assist him. Frank explained he was researching unusual photographic phenomena, chemical processes, that might create disturbing effects in portraits. The librarian directed him to several technical volumes on photography, which Frank carried to a reading table beneath one of the library's magnificent arched windows. He spent 2 hours reading about exposure times, developing techniques, and the chemistry of film and paper. The texts were dense and technical, filled with formulas and procedures that meant little to him. But he found several passages discussing how different lighting conditions could dramatically alter a subject's appearance in photographs. Harsh shadows could create the illusion of deformity. Certain chemical mixtures during development could introduce artifacts that weren't present in the original scene. One book mentioned a phenomenon called spirit photography, a fraudulent practice where photographers created images that appeared to show ghosts or supernatural entities through various tricks involving double exposure and chemical manipulation. Frank copied several passages into his notebook, hoping they might provide an explanation for the photograph's disturbing quality. Perhaps Samuel Rothstein had unknowingly employed some unusual technique that had transformed an ordinary infant's face into something unsettling. But as Frank walked home through the cold November night, past streets where war bond posters urged citizens to support the troops and windows displayed Blue Star flags, indicating sons serving overseas, he found himself doubting this rational explanation. The photograph's effect felt too consistent, too visceral to be merely a technical accident. Everyone who looked at it long enough experienced the same reaction, the same crawling sense that something fundamental was wrong with that child's face. The breakthrough came 3 days later, from an unexpected source. Frank had returned to Greenwich Village to interview more residents, focusing on people who might have interacted with Catherine Wells around the time she visited Rothstein's studio. He was questioning a woman who operated a small grocery on Cornelia Street when her husband, a taciturn man who'd been arranging canned goods on shelves, suddenly spoke up. He remembered seeing a woman matching Catherine's description in mid-October. She'd been standing on the corner of Bleecker and Cornelia, holding a bundle and appearing confused, as though she didn't know which direction to go. What stuck in his memory was her expression, which he described as terrified. Like she was running from something, he explained. Kept looking back over her shoulder. Frank pressed for more details. Had she been alone? Had anyone been following her? The man couldn't say for certain, but he remembered thinking at the time that she seemed out of place in the neighborhood, too frightened and disoriented to be a local resident. He'd considered asking if she needed help, but had been busy unloading a delivery, and by the time he looked again, she'd disappeared. Frank thanked him and spent the next hour walking the streets, trying to imagine Catherine Wells' movements that October morning. If she'd been on Cornelia Street looking lost and frightened, she might have been heading toward Bleecker, toward Rothstein's studio. But why? And what had she been running from? That evening, Frank made a decision that violated department protocols. He took the photograph to see Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a physician who ran a small practice on Washington Square, treating mostly poor families and recent immigrants. Frank had met Elizabeth 2 years earlier during an investigation involving a child abuse case, and he'd been impressed by her keen observational skills and willingness to offer expert opinions that contradicted conventional wisdom. She was one of the few female physicians in New York City, having fought considerable opposition to establish her practice, and she possessed a sharp, analytical mind that Frank respected. Elizabeth studied the photograph under a bright lamp in her office, taking considerably more time than anyone else Frank had shown it to. She examined it from different angles, held it close to her face, and even pulled out a magnifying glass to inspect fine details. Finally, she looked up at Frank with an expression he couldn't quite read. "This child is very ill," she said quietly. "Possibly dying." Frank felt his pulse quicken. He asked what she saw that led to that conclusion. Elizabeth explained that the infant's skin tone, even accounting for the black and white photography and developing process, appeared subtly wrong. The eyes showed signs of jaundice. The facial features, while not overtly deformed, displayed characteristics consistent with severe malnutrition or disease. But there was something else, Elizabeth continued, something she found difficult to articulate in medical terms. The child's expression suggested suffering of an intensity that seemed impossible for such a young infant. Babies experiencing pain typically cried or displayed obvious distress. This child appeared to be enduring something silently, stoically, with an awareness that contradicted everything Elizabeth understood about infant development. "It's as though this baby has lived a lifetime of pain," she told Frank. "And that's what people are reacting to. Not supernatural evil or curses, but genuine human suffering captured in a moment of terrible clarity." Frank left Elizabeth Morrison's office with a new direction for his investigation. If the child in the photograph was seriously ill, that might explain Catherine Wells' behavior and subsequent disappearance. Perhaps she'd been desperate, seeking help for her dying infant and providing false information to avoid questions she couldn't answer. Frank decided to check city hospitals and clinics, searching for records of infants admitted with severe illness around the time Catherine had visited Rothstein's studio. It was a long shot, but it gave him a concrete investigative path to follow. The next morning, Frank began systematically visiting hospitals throughout Lower Manhattan. New York Hospital, Bellevue, St. Vincent's, and several smaller clinics that served poor neighborhoods. He spoke with admitting nurses and records clerks, describing Catherine Wells and showing them the photograph. Most couldn't help, but at St. Vincent's Hospital on 11th Street, a nurse named Agnes Riley studied the portrait, with recognition flickering across her weathered face. She told Frank to wait and disappeared into a back office, returning several minutes later with a patient intake form dated October 10th, 1917. The form listed a woman named Catherine Miller, not Wells, who had brought an infant to the emergency ward complaining of fever and difficulty feeding. The admitting physician had examined the child and noted severe symptoms consistent with what he suspected was tubercular meningitis, a deadly infection that primarily affected infants and young children. The disease caused inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord, leading to fever, seizures, and almost certain death. There was no effective treatment in 1917. The doctor had recommended admission for palliative care, but according to notes scrawled at the bottom of the form, Catherine Miller had refused and left the hospital with her child, despite strong medical advice to remain. Frank felt pieces of the puzzle begin to align. Catherine Wells, or Miller, or whatever her real name was, had known her baby was dying. She'd brought him to St. Vincent's seeking help, but had fled when doctors confirmed the worst. 2 days later, she'd appeared at Rothstein's studio wanting a portrait before her husband supposedly shipped out to France. But Frank now suspected the real reason was simpler and more heartbreaking. She'd wanted one photograph of her child before he died. The false name and address made sense if she was afraid of authorities taking the baby from her, forcing hospitalization, or investigating how the infant had contracted such a serious illness. Frank asked Nurse Riley if she remembered Catherine Miller personally. Agnes nodded slowly, explaining that she'd been working that night and had tried to convince the woman to let her son receive treatment. Catherine had been distraught, but strangely resigned, as though she'd already accepted what was coming. What stuck in Agnes's memory was Catherine's insistence that she needed to take her baby home, that he should die somewhere familiar rather than in a sterile hospital ward. Agnes had seen similar reactions before from mothers facing impossible situations, but something about Catherine's demeanor had suggested deeper complications. She'd seemed not just grief-stricken, but frightened, constantly glancing toward the emergency ward entrance as though expecting someone to arrive. Frank asked if the intake form listed any address. Agnes checked and found a boarding house on Essex Street, several blocks from where Catherine had given Samuel Rothstein the false Christie Street address. Frank thanked her and immediately headed to Essex Street, though he held little hope that Catherine would still be there if she'd ever actually resided at that address. The boarding house was nearly identical to dozens of others in the Lower East Side, a narrow 4-story building with flaking paint and windows covered by thin curtains. The landlord, an Italian man named Vitale, recognized Catherine's description immediately. She'd rented a room on the 3rd floor for 3 weeks in October, Vitale explained, paying in advance with cash. She'd kept to herself, rarely leaving the room except to buy food from nearby street vendors. Other tenants had complained about hearing an infant crying at all hours, but also about long periods of unsettling silence. Vitali had knocked on her door several times to check if everything was acceptable, and Catherine had always assured him through the closed door that everything was fine, that her baby was simply sick but recovering. Then, on October 19th, she'd left without notice, abandoning the few possessions she'd brought with her. Vitali had kept them for a week in case she returned, but when she didn't, he'd sold or discarded everything. Frank asked what Catherine had left behind. Vitali led him upstairs to a storage closet, filled with unclaimed belongings from former tenants. He rummaged through boxes and pulled out a small cloth bag containing a few items: a worn Bible, a broken pocket watch, a letter written in neat script but never sent, and a christening gown yellowed with age. Frank examined each item carefully. The Bible had an inscription on the inside cover: "To Catherine from Mother, Christmas 1895. That meant Catherine was likely in her early 20s, which matched the age of the woman in the photograph. The letter was addressed to someone named James Miller at an army training camp in New Jersey. Frank read it carefully. The letter began with endearments and updates about daily life, the kind of mundane details soldiers overseas wanted to hear from home. But halfway through, Catherine's tone shifted dramatically. She wrote about the baby being sick, about doctors who couldn't help, about her growing certainty that God was punishing her for sins she couldn't name. The writing became increasingly disordered toward the end, sentences fragmenting into phrases that suggested mounting desperation. She mentioned needing to do something important before the baby died, to preserve something that would last after he was gone. The letter ended mid-sentence, as though Catherine had been interrupted or had simply lost the ability to continue. Frank folded the letter carefully and asked if he could take these items as evidence. Vitali agreed, seeming relieved to have them removed from his property. Frank returned to the precinct with a much clearer picture of what had happened. Catherine Miller was a young mother whose husband had been drafted and sent to training camp, leaving her alone with a critically ill infant. She'd sought medical help, been told nothing could be done, and had then commissioned a photograph as a final memorial. The false names and addresses suggested she was either hiding from someone or trying to avoid authorities for reasons Frank hadn't yet determined. But where was she now? And more importantly, what had happened to the dying child? Frank spent the evening writing a detailed report of his investigation, organizing the facts chronologically and noting the questions that remained unanswered. He included Dr. Morrison's medical observations about the infant's appearance and Nurse Riley's account of the hospital visit. As he wrote, he found himself returning repeatedly to the photograph itself, which he'd propped against a stack of files on his desk. Even knowing the medical explanation for the child's disturbing appearance, Frank couldn't shake the unsettling effect it produced. There was something in those infant eyes that transcended illness or suffering, something that felt almost accusatory, as though the baby was staring out from the photograph demanding answers or justice. The following morning, Frank decided to track down James Miller, Catherine's husband. If the man was indeed in military training, there would be records at the recruitment office. Frank walked to the federal building on Chambers Street, where Army recruitment and draft administration offices occupied several floors. A bored clerk searched through filing cabinets and eventually produced a card for Private James Miller, inducted on September 15, 1917, and sent to Camp Dix in New Jersey for basic training. The card listed his last known address as the same Essex Street boarding house where Catherine had lived. There was also a notation in red ink dated November 5th, indicating that Private Miller had been absent without leave for 3 weeks and was currently listed as a deserter. This new information complicated Frank's understanding of the situation considerably. James Miller had abandoned his military training around the same time Catherine had disappeared from the boarding house. Were they together? Had James returned to New York to find his wife and sick child? The Army would be looking for him, and desertion during wartime was a serious offense that could result in imprisonment or worse. Frank needed to find both Catherine and James Miller, but he now understood he was searching for people who had powerful reasons to remain hidden. They weren't just grieving parents. They were fugitives running from multiple authorities, carrying a dying infant through a city that had grown increasingly paranoid and unforgiving as the war consumed more resources and lives. Frank spent the next 2 days piecing together James Miller's movements after his desertion from Camp Dix. Military police had investigated briefly, but with thousands of soldiers in training and hundreds deserting monthly, resources were stretched thin. The army's priority was getting men to France, not chasing down every frightened recruit who fled. Frank learned from camp records that James had left on October 20th, the day after Catherine had abandoned the Essex Street boarding house. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Somehow James had learned about his son's condition and had risked court-martial to return to New York. Frank began checking places where deserters typically hid in the city: flophouses in the Bowery, anarchist meeting halls in Greenwich Village, labor union offices where anti-war sentiment ran strong despite government crackdowns. The Espionage Act had made criticizing the draft or military service punishable by imprisonment, but underground networks still helped young men avoid conscription or harbored deserters fleeing training camps. Frank walked carefully through these investigations, knowing that revealing his true purpose might close doors or, worse, make him a target. Opposition to the war remained fierce among certain groups, particularly immigrant communities and socialist organizations who viewed the conflict as capitalist bloodshed that would sacrifice working-class lives for profit. At a union hall on East 4th Street, Frank finally found someone willing to talk. A man named Dominic Russo, a dock worker and union organizer who'd known James Miller before his induction, admitted he'd seen James briefly in late October. James had appeared desperate, asking if anyone knew Catherine's whereabouts or had seen her with their infant son. Dominic had directed him to the Essex Street boarding house, but by then Catherine had already disappeared. James had seemed on the verge of collapse, Dominic recalled, muttering about needing to find his family before something terrible happened. When Dominic had asked what he meant, James had simply shaken his head and left. That was the last Dominic had seen of him. Frank pressed for more information about the Miller family's background. Dominic explained that James had worked on the docks until his draft notice arrived in September. He'd been a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, but Dominic knew he'd married Catherine about 2 years earlier. She'd been working in a textile factory in the garment district when they met. The baby had come a year later in early 1917. Dominic had attended the christening at a small Catholic church on Mott Street. Everything had seemed normal then. Just another working-class family, struggling to get by in an expensive city during increasingly difficult times. Food prices had risen steadily as the war consumed resources, and wages hadn't kept pace. Armed with this new information, Frank visited the church where the infant had been christened. The priest, Father O'Malley, was an elderly Irishman who'd served the parish for 30 years and knew most of his congregants intimately. He remembered the Miller family well, particularly Catherine, who'd attended Mass regularly throughout her pregnancy. Father O'Malley described her as devout but troubled, often staying after services to pray alone in the empty church. He'd offered spiritual counsel several times, sensing she carried burdens beyond typical young mother anxieties. Catherine had never confided specifics, but the priest had gotten the impression she was running from something or someone in her past. The baby's christening had occurred in February 1917, Father O'Malley recalled. Catherine had chosen the name Thomas after her father, who'd died when she was young. The infant had seemed healthy then, though Father O'Malley noted that Catherine had held him with an almost desperate protectiveness, as though afraid someone might take him from her arms. James had been present, but subdued, standing slightly apart from his wife during the ceremony. Father O'Malley had found this distance troubling, but hadn't intervened. Families had their own dynamics, and he'd learned not to judge too quickly. Frank asked if Father O'Malley had seen the Millers after the christening. The priest nodded sadly. Catherine had continued attending Mass through the spring and summer, always with baby Thomas. But around August, she'd stopped coming to church entirely. Father O'Malley had visited the Essex Street boarding house once to check on her, concerned by her sudden absence. Catherine had answered the door but hadn't invited him inside. She'd assured him everything was fine, that Thomas was simply fussy and made it difficult to attend services. But Father O'Malley had glimpsed the baby over her shoulder and had been shocked by his appearance. The healthy infant from February had transformed into a wasted, pale child who looked far older than his months. Father O'Malley had tried to discuss the baby's condition, offering to arrange medical help through Catholic charities, but Catherine had thanked him and closed the door. The priest had left troubled, considering whether to report potential neglect to authorities, but ultimately deciding against it. He'd seen too many families destroyed by well-meaning interventions that resulted in children being taken from loving parents who simply lacked resources. He'd prayed instead that Catherine would find the help she needed. Now, hearing Frank's account of subsequent events, Father O'Malley felt guilt weighing heavily on his conscience. Perhaps if he'd acted differently, the Millers wouldn't have disappeared into whatever fate had claimed them. Frank thanked the priest and left with a more complete picture of the Miller family's trajectory. A healthy baby in February had become critically ill by August. Catherine had withdrawn from her community and support systems, hiding the child's deteriorating condition. James had been drafted in September, leaving Catherine alone with a dying infant. She'd sought medical help in October, been told nothing could be done, and had commissioned a portrait as a final memorial before disappearing with her child. Then James had deserted and come looking for his family, only to find them vanished without a trace. But where were they now? Frank considered possibilities. Catherine might have taken Thomas somewhere to die peacefully, away from the city and its judgmental eyes. She might have returned to Pennsylvania, to whatever family or hometown she'd left behind. Or, Frank thought darkly, the baby might already be dead, and Catherine might have done something desperate to avoid questions about how her infant had died. The photograph suggested the child had been near death when it was taken in mid-October. It was now late November, 6 weeks later. No infant with tubercular meningitis survived that long without treatment. That evening, Frank made a decision that would have gotten him suspended if his captain discovered it. He contacted the Bureau of Investigation, the federal agency tasked with enforcing the Espionage Act and tracking down draft evaders and deserters. Frank had dealt with Bureau agents before and found them overzealous and often reckless in their pursuit of suspected radicals and anti-war dissidents. But they had resources and authority that exceeded local police capabilities, particularly when it came to tracking people across state lines. Frank couldn't officially request their assistance in what was technically not a crime investigation, but he could unofficially provide information about James Miller's desertion in exchange for access to any intelligence they'd gathered. The agent Frank met with, a humorless man named William Garrett, listened to Frank's account with growing interest. The Bureau had indeed been tracking James Miller, though not intensively given how many deserters they were pursuing simultaneously. Garrett revealed that informants had placed James in Philadelphia in early November, suggesting he might have headed south or west from New York. But the trail had gone cold after that. Garrett asked why a New York detective cared so much about a military deserter. Frank explained his investigation into Catherine's disappearance, emphasizing the sick infant and the disturbing photograph that had started everything. Garrett studied the photograph for a long moment, his expression unchanging. He told Frank that the Bureau had encountered several cases where families of soldiers had disappeared or behaved erratically under the stress of wartime separation and financial hardship. Some women had mental breakdowns, others had abandoned their children or committed desperate acts. The war was revealing how fragile social structures truly were when subjected to sustained pressure. Garrett promised to notify Frank if the Bureau located James Miller, but he made clear that their priority was returning deserters to military custody, not reuniting families or solving local mysteries. Frank accepted these terms, knowing he had few alternatives. Walking home that night through streets decorated with patriotic banners and war bond posters, Frank felt the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He'd spent 2 weeks tracking down information about a woman and child who might already be dead, about a deserter who was likely hundreds of miles away, all because a photograph had unsettled people who looked at it too long. Captain O'Brien had been right to question whether this constituted proper police work, but Frank couldn't abandon the case. Something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong, as though the photograph had captured not just a dying infant, but evidence of something larger and more troubling that Frank couldn't yet articulate. He needed answers, not just for his investigation but for his own peace of mind. December arrived with the first heavy snowfall of winter, blanketing New York in white, that quickly turned to grey slush under the traffic of countless feet and vehicles. The war news from Europe remained grim. American troops were dying in French trenches, though newspapers sanitized casualty reports to maintain public morale. The city felt simultaneously anxious and exhausted, caught between patriotic fervor and growing weariness with shortages, restrictions, and the daily reminders of a conflict that seemed to have no end. Frank continued his search for the Miller family, though he'd run out of obvious leads and was beginning to grasp at increasingly unlikely possibilities. On December 5th, Frank received an unexpected telegram from Bureau Agent Garrett. It contained only brief information. James Miller had been arrested in Baltimore, attempting to board a ship bound for South America. He was being held at a federal detention facility, pending transfer back to Camp Dix for court-martial. The telegram included no details about whether James had been alone or if Catherine and the baby had been with him. Frank immediately requested leave from the precinct and caught an afternoon train to Baltimore, arriving late that evening in a city he barely knew, following instincts that told him this might be his only chance to find answers. The detention facility occupied a converted warehouse near the harbor, a grim building surrounded by chain-link fencing and guarded by military police. Frank presented his credentials and explained he needed to question a prisoner about a related investigation in New York. The commanding officer, a captain named Edwards, was initially reluctant but eventually agreed to allow Frank 30 minutes with James Miller. Edwards led Frank through corridors that echoed with voices and the metallic sounds of cell doors, finally stopping at a small interrogation room where James Miller sat handcuffed to a table, looking like a man who'd already accepted his fate. James was younger than Frank had expected, perhaps 25, with the lean build and calloused hands of someone who'd worked physically demanding jobs, but his face showed the devastation of recent weeks. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, his cheeks were hollow, and he'd developed a nervous habit of grinding his teeth that created a subtle clicking sound. When Frank entered and introduced himself, James looked up with an expression that mixed hope and despair in equal measure. He asked immediately if Frank had found Catherine and Thomas. The raw desperation in his voice made Frank's chest tighten with sympathy he struggled to maintain professional distance from. Frank explained his investigation, describing how the photograph had led him through the layers of the Miller family's story. He laid the portrait on the table between them, and James stared at it for a long moment before covering his face with his shackled hands. His shoulders shook with silent sobs that eventually became audible. When he finally composed himself enough to speak, James told Frank everything, the words pouring out as though he'd been waiting weeks for someone to listen, someone who might understand, rather than simply judge and condemn. James explained that Thomas had been born healthy, a normal infant who'd brought joy into their difficult lives. But around 6 months old, the baby had developed a fever that wouldn't break. They'd taken him to a free clinic where a doctor had diagnosed tubercular meningitis, likely contracted from another child at a tenement where Catherine had been living before they'd found the Essex Street room. The doctor had been blunt about the prognosis. Thomas would die probably within weeks, possibly in considerable pain. There was no treatment, no hope, only the terrible certainty of watching their child suffer and fade. Catherine had refused to accept this, James continued. She'd sought second opinions from other doctors, spent money they didn't have on useless medicines and treatments, prayed constantly for a miracle. But Thomas had only gotten worse. By September, when James received his draft notice, the baby barely responded to stimuli, his small body consumed by disease. James had tried to get an exemption based on family hardship, but the draft board had denied it. Thousands of men had sick children. That didn't excuse them from serving their country. James had reported to Camp Dix as ordered, believing he had no choice, leaving Catherine alone with their dying son. The training camp had been brutal, James explained, not just the physical demands, but the psychological weight of knowing his child was dying while he learned to kill strangers in a war he didn't understand. He'd written to Catherine daily but received few responses. The letters she did send became increasingly disturbing, filled with religious imagery and suggestions that Thomas's illness was punishment for sins they'd committed. James had grown frantic with worry. In mid-October, he'd received a telegram from a neighbor saying Catherine had disappeared from the boarding house without explanation. That same day, James had walked away from Camp Dix, knowing he was committing a crime, but unable to care. His family needed him more than the army did. He'd returned to New York and spent days searching for Catherine and Thomas, following cold trails and dead ends through neighborhoods where people either hadn't seen his family or refused to help a deserter. Frank listened carefully as James described visiting the same locations Frank had later investigated, talking to the same people, experiencing the same frustrations. Eventually, James had concluded that Catherine must have left the city entirely. He'd remembered her mentioning once that she had an aunt in Pennsylvania, though she'd never wanted to discuss her family or past. James had traveled there to a small mining town near Scranton, but found no trace of Catherine or her relatives. Desperate and running out of money, James had made his way to Baltimore with a vague plan to find work on a ship, to escape the country and the charges awaiting him. But he'd been recognized at the docks by someone who'd reported him to authorities. Now he sat facing court-martial for desertion, imprisonment, possibly even execution depending on how harsh the military chose to be. But James insisted he didn't care about his own fate. He needed to know what had happened to Catherine and Thomas. Were they alive? Was his son still suffering? Had Catherine done something drastic in her disturbed mental state? These questions tortured him more than any punishment the army could inflict. Frank asked the question he'd been dreading. Did James think Catherine might have harmed Thomas to end his suffering? James was silent for a long moment before answering. He said Catherine loved their son more than anything, but her mental state had deteriorated significantly in the months before James's induction. She'd become obsessed with religious concepts of sin and redemption, convinced that Thomas's illness was divine punishment. James had tried to reason with her, to explain that diseases simply happened and weren't moral judgments, but Catherine had retreated into a worldview where everything had spiritual meaning. James admitted he feared what Catherine might have done while alone with their dying child, convinced she was saving him from prolonged suffering or protecting him from some imagined greater harm. Frank asked about the photograph. James explained that Catherine had mentioned wanting to have Thomas's portrait taken before he died, to preserve some memory of him that didn't show his illness so starkly. Frank found this revealing. Catherine had been planning something even before James deserted, preparing for an ending she could foresee. The photograph wasn't just a memorial. It was evidence of premeditation, proof that Catherine had been thinking several steps ahead. But planning what? That remained unclear. James had no idea where Catherine might have gone after leaving New York, what resources she might have accessed, or who might have helped her. Captain Edwards returned after 30 minutes to end the interview. Frank requested permission to visit again if necessary, which Edwards granted reluctantly. Frank shook James's hand before leaving, promising he would continue searching for Catherine and Thomas. As he walked back through the detention facility, Frank felt the case's complexity multiply. He was no longer just tracking a missing woman and sick child. He was trying to understand the psychology of a mother driven to desperate extremes by grief, illness, poverty, and possibly religious delusion. The photograph had captured Thomas at a specific moment, but it couldn't reveal what had happened before or after that shutter click. Only finding Catherine could provide those answers. Frank returned to New York the following morning, his mind churning through possibilities during the long train ride. He now understood that Catherine had been planning something for weeks before disappearing. The false names, the abandoned boarding house, the unclaimed photograph, all suggested someone preparing to vanish completely. But where would a poor woman with a dying infant go? What resources could she access? Frank realized he needed to think differently about Catherine, to see her not as a desperate victim, but as someone making calculated decisions to achieve goals he didn't yet understand. The photograph was a clue, but perhaps not to Catherine's location. Perhaps it was meant to communicate something else entirely, a message preserved in that disturbing image of mother and child that Frank hadn't yet learned to read correctly. Frank returned to Samuel Rothstein's studio on a grey December morning, carrying questions he hoped the photographer might help answer. Samuel was surprised to see him again, assuming the investigation had concluded or been abandoned. Frank asked to examine the photograph once more, but this time with Samuel's professional expertise. He wanted to understand what the camera had captured, beyond the obvious image of mother and child. Were there details in the composition, the lighting, the expressions that revealed information Frank had missed? Samuel retrieved the portrait from where he'd stored it, after Frank had returned it weeks earlier. They studied it together under the bright light Samuel used for examining negatives. Samuel pointed out technical aspects. The exposure had been perfectly balanced, neither under nor overexposed. The focus was sharp, capturing fine details of fabric texture and skin tone. But there was something unusual about Catherine's positioning, Samuel explained. She'd held Thomas at a specific angle, turned slightly away from the camera, as though she wanted the baby's face to be the primary focus rather than her own. Most mothers did the opposite, making sure they were equally prominent in the frame. Frank asked if Catherine had given Samuel specific instructions about how to compose the photograph. Samuel thought carefully before answering. Catherine had been very particular about the positioning, he recalled. She'd adjusted Thomas several times before seeming satisfied. She'd also requested that Samuel not retouch the final image, which was unusual given that most clients wanted blemishes removed and features enhanced. Catherine had insisted the photograph show Thomas exactly as he was, with no alterations or improvements. At the time, Samuel had found this request odd, but had honored it. Now discussing it with Frank, he recognized it as significant. Catherine had wanted documentation, not beautification. This observation triggered a new line of thinking for Frank. What if the photograph wasn't primarily meant as a memorial? What if Catherine had created it as evidence, proof of Thomas's condition at a specific moment in time? But evidence for what purpose? To show to doctors, perhaps, though she'd already received terminal diagnoses from multiple physicians. To send to James at training camp, demonstrating how ill their son had become, though she could have done that more easily with a letter. Or perhaps, Frank thought with growing unease, as evidence for some future reckoning, documentation that would prove what she'd endured and justify actions she was planning to take. Frank asked Samuel if Catherine had purchased additional copies of the photograph. Samuel checked his records and confirmed that Catherine had ordered only one print, the standard portrait size. She hadn't requested wallet-sized copies to share with relatives or larger versions for framing, just the single image, which she'd then never collected. This too seemed significant. If the photograph was meant as evidence rather than a keepsake, Catherine might have planned to retrieve it only when necessary, leaving it in Samuel's possession as a form of neutral storage that wouldn't connect directly back to her. Frank spent the afternoon at the New York Public Library again, this time researching historical cases of mothers who'd killed their terminally ill children. Such cases existed in criminal records and newspaper archives, though they were relatively rare and often treated with sympathy by courts that recognized the impossible situations some parents faced. Frank read about mercy killings where mothers had ended their children's suffering rather than watch them die slowly and painfully. He read about mothers driven to madness by poverty and desperation, who'd killed their children, believing they were saving them from worse fates. The cases shared common elements: social isolation, economic hardship, lack of support systems, and often strong religious convictions that became distorted under psychological pressure. One case from 1912 particularly caught Frank's attention. A woman in Philadelphia had smothered her infant son, who suffered from a congenital condition that caused constant pain. She'd then attempted suicide, but survived. During her trial, she testified that God had told her to end her son's suffering, that keeping him alive was actually cruel and sinful. The jury had found her not guilty by reason of insanity, and she'd been committed to an asylum rather than prison. The judge's ruling had emphasized that the woman's mental state had been compromised by prolonged stress and religious delusion, making her incapable of understanding the moral dimensions of her actions. Frank wondered if Catherine Miller might have followed a similar path. The religious imagery in her unfinished letter to James, combined with Father O'Malley's observations about her troubled devotion, suggested someone whose faith had become warped by circumstances. Catherine might have convinced herself that ending Thomas's suffering was actually merciful, even holy, that God wanted her to spare her son from prolonged agony. This psychological framework would explain her careful planning and the photograph's documentary quality. She'd been building a case to justify actions she knew others would condemn, but that she believed were righteous. But this theory raised an immediate question. Where was Catherine now if she'd killed Thomas? If she would have needed to dispose of his body in a way that avoided immediate detection. Then she would have either attempted suicide or fled to avoid prosecution. Frank checked police reports from October and November for any unidentified female bodies found in New York or surrounding areas. He found several, but none matching Catherine's description. He checked hospital records for suicide attempts or women admitted with severe psychological disturbances. Again, no Catherine Miller or variations of that name appeared. The alternative was that Catherine had successfully disappeared with Thomas's body, perhaps traveling somewhere remote to bury him, and then starting a new life under a false identity. But this seemed implausible for a poor woman with limited resources and no obvious skills for creating new documentation. Frank was missing something, some piece of the puzzle that would make Catherine's actions and motivations coherent. He'd assembled fragments, the photograph, the deserter husband, the dying baby, the religious delusion, but they hadn't yet formed a complete picture. On December 15th, Frank received a letter forwarded from Captain Edwards at the Baltimore detention facility. James Miller had written, asking if Frank had made progress finding Catherine. The letter was heartbreaking in its desperation, filled with self-recrimination about abandoning his family by going to Camp Dix, about not protecting Catherine from her own deteriorating mental state. James explained that his court-martial was scheduled for January, that he expected a harsh sentence, possibly decades in military prison. He begged Frank to continue searching, to find out what had happened to his wife and son, so that at least he could face punishment, knowing the truth rather than tormented by uncertainty. Frank wrote back immediately, explaining his theories and the leads he was pursuing. He promised James he wouldn't abandon the investigation, though he admitted the trail had gone cold and he was running out of options. Frank didn't mention that Captain O'Brien had ordered him to stop devoting time to what O'Brien considered a non-case, a personal obsession that was interfering with Frank's actual duties. Frank had been conducting the investigation on his own time for the past 2 weeks, spending evenings and Sundays following leads that led nowhere, driven by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain to himself. The photograph remained on Frank's desk at home, propped against a stack of books. He looked at it every evening, studying Thomas's face, searching for clues in those pale, knowing eyes. The infant's expression had become almost familiar through repeated viewing, though no less disturbing. Frank had begun to understand what others had reacted to so strongly. The baby looked haunted, burdened by awareness no child should possess. Whether this was simply an artifact of illness and suffering captured by accident, or whether Catherine had deliberately arranged her son's features to convey this impression, Frank couldn't determine. But the image had become central to his understanding of the case, a fixed point around which all other evidence orbited. Late one night, studying the photograph under lamplight with a magnifying glass, Frank noticed something he'd overlooked before. In the background, barely visible behind Catherine's shoulder, was a window. Through that window, reflected in the glass, was the faint outline of buildings. Frank couldn't make out specific details, but the architectural style suggested they weren't New York tenements. The roof lines looked different, the spacing between structures unusual. Frank brought the photograph back to Samuel Rothstein the next morning and asked if the background was from his studio. Samuel confirmed it was, explaining that he'd positioned Catherine in front of the window specifically to use natural light for the portrait. But Frank realized the reflection in the glass wasn't showing what was behind the camera. It was showing what lay behind the window itself, outside Samuel's studio. Could those buildings be identified? Could they pinpoint Samuel's exact location and, by extension, reveal something about Catherine's movements that day? Samuel wasn't sure, but suggested Frank consult a surveyor or architect who might recognize the building patterns. This felt like a long shot, but Frank had nothing else. He photographed the photograph, enlarging the tiny reflection, creating a new image from the background of the original. It was blurry and indistinct, but it was something. A new thread to pull, possibly the one that would unravel the entire mystery. Frank took the enlarged reflection image to the city planning office, where a surveyor named Peterson agreed to examine it. Peterson studied the blurry shapes through various lenses and measurement tools, making notes and sketches. After an hour of analysis, he looked up at Frank with an expression of surprise. The buildings in the reflection weren't in Greenwich Village at all, Peterson explained. The architectural style and spacing matched the waterfront district near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, several miles from Rothstein's studio. This was impossible unless the reflection was showing something other than the immediate exterior view through the window. Frank returned to Samuel's studio with this information, confused and increasingly convinced that something fundamental about the photograph didn't make sense. Samuel listened to Peterson's analysis and then suddenly laughed, a bitter sound without humor. He explained that Frank had misunderstood the studio setup. The window in the photograph's background wasn't a real window. It was a painted backdrop, one of several Samuel used for portraits. He'd created it years ago, painting a scene based on sketches he'd made of the Brooklyn waterfront, where he'd lived when he first arrived in America. The buildings in the reflection were painted details, not real structures photographed through glass. This revelation simultaneously solved one mystery and deepened others. The reflection wasn't a clue to Catherine's location or movements, but it confirmed something else. Samuel's studio created images that weren't entirely what they appeared to be. The backdrop introduced false elements, artificial details that a casual observer might mistake for real environmental features. Frank wondered if this principle extended to other aspects of the photograph. What else might not be what it seemed? Was Thomas actually Catherine's son, or had she borrowed or taken someone else's child for the portrait? Was Catherine actually Catherine, or had someone assumed that identity for unknown purposes? Frank asked Samuel if he'd be able to recognize Catherine Miller if he saw her again. Samuel considered this carefully before admitting he wasn't certain. She'd worn a hat that partially obscured her face, kept her eyes downcast most of the time, and had spoken so quietly he'd strained to hear her. He remembered an impression of her rather than specific features: pale skin, dark hair, thin build, unremarkable clothing. These details described thousands of working-class women in New York. Samuel had created dozens of portraits in the weeks since October. Catherine's face had blurred together with all the others, distinguishable now only because of the disturbing quality of the photograph she'd commissioned. This lack of certainty frustrated Frank, but also opened new investigative possibilities. If Samuel couldn't reliably identify Catherine, then perhaps the woman who'd posed as Catherine Miller wasn't actually Catherine at all. Perhaps someone else had brought Thomas to be photographed, using a false name, an invented story about a husband shipping out to France. But why would someone do this? What purpose would it serve to commission a portrait of a dying child under a false identity? Frank constructed theories. Maybe Thomas had been kidnapped from his real parents, and the photograph was meant to document possession. Maybe Thomas was being used in some fraudulent charity scheme, his heartbreaking condition exploited to extract donations. Maybe the photograph was meant to be sent to someone as a threat or warning. Each theory raised more questions than it answered. Frank needed to verify whether Catherine Miller actually existed as the person she'd claimed to be. He returned to Father O'Malley and asked if he could see the church's christening records from February 1917. The priest retrieved the leather-bound registry and showed Frank the entry for Thomas Miller, son of James and Catherine Miller, christened on February 18th. The entry looked legitimate, recorded in the same handwriting as surrounding entries, with no signs of later alteration or forgery. Father O'Malley's signature appeared at the bottom, authenticating the ceremony. But Frank noticed something curious. The entry listed Catherine's maiden name as Brennan and indicated she'd been born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in 1895. Frank asked Father O'Malley if he'd verified this information personally. The priest admitted he hadn't. Parents provided biographical details for church records, and he'd simply recorded what Catherine had told him. There was no process for confirming accuracy. Most people had no reason to lie about such basic facts. Frank thanked Father O'Malley and left with a new direction. If Catherine had been born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, there would be birth records, possibly family still living there who could verify her identity. and provide information about her current whereabouts. Frank sent telegrams to the Bethlehem town clerk and the local police department, asking if they had records of a Catherine Brennan born in 1895. The responses took several days, but eventually arrived. The town clerk found no record of any Catherine Brennan born that year, though their records from the 1890s were incomplete and poorly maintained. The police department had no information, but suggested Frank contact local churches, since many births were recorded in religious registries before civil registration became standard. Frank sent additional telegrams to Catholic churches in Bethlehem and surrounding towns, explaining his investigation and requesting information about the Brennan family. While waiting for responses, Frank experienced a growing sense of the case collapsing around him. Every concrete detail he'd assembled was proving unreliable or false. Catherine Miller might not be Catherine Miller. Her husband James might not actually be her husband. The baby Thomas might not be their son. The addresses were fake, the names possibly fake. Even the photograph itself was partly artifice, with its painted backdrop creating false environmental context. Frank felt like he was investigating a ghost, someone who'd deliberately constructed an elaborate fiction for purposes he couldn't fathom. On December 23rd, as New York prepared for Christmas, amid ongoing war anxieties, Frank received a telegram from a priest in Bethlehem who remembered the Brennan family. Catherine Brennan had indeed existed, born in 1895 to Irish immigrant parents. But she died of influenza in 1912 at age 17, buried in the church cemetery. The priest had performed her funeral service and maintained careful records of all parishioner deaths. He was certain about the information because Catherine's death had been particularly tragic. She'd been engaged to be married just weeks before contracting the illness that killed her. Her parents had both subsequently died, her father in a mining accident in 1914, and her mother of grief shortly after. Frank sat staring at the telegram for a long time, understanding finally flooding through him. The woman who'd called herself Catherine Miller had stolen a dead girl's identity, using biographical details that would be difficult to verify, but specific enough to seem authentic. This meant everything James Miller had told Frank was either a lie or based on lies his supposed wife had told him. The woman might not be Catherine at all. Thomas might not be her son. The entire narrative Frank had constructed could be fiction built on a foundation of carefully orchestrated deception. But why? What could motivate someone to create such an elaborate false identity, marry a man under that false identity, and live as Catherine Miller for at least 2 years before commissioning a disturbing photograph of a dying infant and disappearing? Frank considered criminal possibilities: insurance fraud, though he'd found no policies; inheritance theft, though James Miller had no money or assets; hiding from previous crimes, though what crimes would require such extensive identity construction? Nothing made sense until Frank considered one more possibility that made his blood run cold. What if the baby in the photograph wasn't dying naturally? What if Thomas's condition was the result of deliberate harm, and the woman calling herself Catherine had been documenting his deterioration as part of some grotesque experiment or exploitation? The photograph's disturbing quality might not be capturing illness but intentional cruelty, systematic abuse that had transformed a healthy infant into the haunted creature staring out from the image. This theory explained why Catherine had been so specific about not retouching the photograph, why she'd positioned Thomas to make his face the primary focus, why she'd never returned to collect it. The portrait wasn't a memorial or evidence for future justification. It was a trophy, documentation of something terrible she'd accomplished. Frank felt simultaneously horrified by this theory and certain it was correct. Everything fit if he stopped assuming Catherine Miller was a desperate mother driven to extremes by circumstances, and instead saw her as someone deliberately cruel, someone who'd constructed an entire false life to enable whatever she'd done to that child. But this meant Thomas might still be alive, might be suffering continued abuse while Frank had been chasing ghosts through New York's neighborhoods. He needed to find Catherine immediately, needed to discover her real identity and stop whatever she was doing. Frank worked through Christmas and into the new year with renewed urgency, assembling every piece of information he'd gathered and looking for patterns he'd missed. He examined the photograph again with fresh eyes, no longer searching for clues about Catherine's location, but for evidence of what she'd done to Thomas. Dr. Morrison's earlier observation about the child showing signs of severe malnutrition took on sinister significance. Frank wondered if Thomas had been systematically starved, deprived of nutrition deliberately to create his wasted appearance. The thought made him physically ill, but he forced himself to consider all possibilities. On January 7, 1918, Frank received an unexpected visitor at the precinct. A woman named Helen Cartwright introduced herself as a social worker with the Children's Aid Society. She'd heard about Frank's investigation through channels she didn't specify and had information that might be relevant. Helen explained that in late October, a woman matching Catherine Miller's description had attempted to surrender an infant to the Society's office in Brooklyn, claiming she couldn't care for him and wanted him placed with a family who could provide better conditions. But when staff members had examined the baby and seen his alarming condition, they'd insisted on immediate medical evaluation. The woman had suddenly changed her mind, Helen continued, claiming she'd made a mistake and wanted to keep her son after all. She'd grabbed the infant and fled the office before anyone could stop her. Staff had reported the incident to police, concerned about the child's welfare, but no investigation had followed up. Helen had kept the case file, troubled by the encounter, and when she'd heard about a detective asking questions about a woman and sick baby, she'd recognized the possible connection. She showed Frank the intake form from that October visit. The woman had given her name as Catherine Wells, the same false name she'd provided to Samuel Rothstein. This new information confirmed Frank's darkest suspicions. Catherine had tried to dispose of Thomas when his condition had become too difficult to manage, but had fled when questions were asked. She was still out there somewhere, possibly with Thomas, possibly having harmed or killed him since that failed surrender attempt in Brooklyn. Frank now had evidence of potential child endangerment and possibly abuse that justified official resources being devoted to finding Catherine Miller and determining Thomas's fate. Frank presented everything to Captain O'Brien, laying out the evidence methodically and making the case that this had become a legitimate criminal investigation requiring department support. O'Brien listened carefully and agreed this had moved beyond Frank's personal obsession into actual police business. He authorized Frank to pursue it full-time and assigned 2 additional detectives to assist. The search for Catherine Miller, whoever she really was, became the precinct's priority. The photograph that had started everything now hung on the precinct's investigation board, Thomas's haunted face staring out at the detectives working to find him, to save him if he was still alive, or to bring him justice if he wasn't. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.